Our annual Nellie Bly Award, named for the intrepid 19th century reporter who helped pioneer the field of investigative journalism, honors the courageous and essential work of today's investigative reporters. Tonight, it is our great honor to present the 8th annual Nellie Bly Award for investigative reporting to the ProPublica investigative team. In 2023, a groundbreaking investigation unveiled the intricate and often hidden relationships between the U.S. Supreme Court and a select group of billionaire donors. It's a story that resonates with the essence of democracy and the vital role of transparency in our society. Through meticulous research, relentless questioning, and a steadfast commitment to uncovering the truth, these journalists unearthed critical information that raises important questions about the influence of wealth on our judicial system. ProPublica's groundbreaking reporting on the shadow world of gifts and influence among Supreme Court justices earned the outlet the Pulitzer Prize as well as the 8th annual Nellie Bly Award. Let us celebrate the power of journalism in strengthening our democracy, and let us honor those who dare to unveil the truth. Thank you, ProPublica.
I'd like to thank our trustee, Veronica Medina, and her team for producing the video. And I'd also like to heartily thank our partners for this afternoon's program, the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, and the League of Women Voters of Albany County. Yes. Our partnership reflects a mutual interest in promoting ethical leadership, as well as fostering an empowered and informed electorate. We are delighted and honored to have two members of the ProPublica team with us today, Andy Kroll and Ilya Marritz, and I would like to present them with this Nellie Bly Award trophy. We give this award in grateful recognition of their vital work to the public and as a way to honor the legacy of the pioneering 19th century reporter, Nellie Bly. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Should we sit?
Would you like to make remarks?
Sure, yeah. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, obviously, first and foremost, thank you to Bruce and the Museum of Political Corruption for this incredible award and this incredible video, by the way, which did not know was coming, but we really appreciate. Obviously, we couldn't have done this work without the support of our newsroom, editors, lawyers, researchers, fact checkers, but just for myself personally, and then I'm passing the mic to you, so much of the Supreme Court reporting that we did, that my colleagues did, was fueled by readers. People that contacted us out of the blue with information, with ideas, with tips that drove us forward. And in a lot of cases when we were at a sort of standstill and wondering where this series would go, someone, sometimes completely out of the blue, in an email and a phone call, came forward and said, hey, this is something you should look into, or hey, what about this particular angle of your investigation? And so I say this to all of you, especially thank you if you read us, if you support ProPublica, if you've ever sent us an email and said, hey, you should check this out, and if you haven't, our emails are all online. Email us anytime. Thank you very much, especially to the people who help us do what we do.
Yeah, a big thanks to Bruce and your team with the Museum of Political Corruption. Investigations are hard, and we don't always hear about the enormous amount of kind of self-doubt that a reporter lives with while they're kind of exploring a hunch, making phone calls. There's a whole pre-publication period that at ProPublica can stretch out for months, sometimes past a year, as you're trying to put something together. And when it does see the light of day, and when it does hit, and when people then get in touch with you and tell you that they read your work or heard your work or that it meant something to them, it's just tremendously meaningful. So I think Andy and I both are really soaking in this moment, and I'm really happy to see all of your faces here, so thank you.
At this time, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our panel discussion, Rex Smith. For many of you who are even casual listeners to WAMC or picked up a local paper, Rex hardly needs introduction. Rex served for 26 years with the Albany Times-Union, serving 18 of those years as the newspaper's editor. He is the founder of the online journal, The Upstate American, and is a host of the Media Project, a nationally syndicated program produced by Northeast Public Radio. Rex, will you come up?
Thank you. And let's, would you two also please come up while I introduce the panel? We just add a music stand here. Not that I'm going to sing. But 1 week from right now, Albany for Musical will be performing at the Troy Savings Bank Music Hall. So how about that? You'd like to be there, wouldn't you? All right. Just my other hat. I just want to make a couple of introductory remarks for this great panel that we're going to have. Everyone in this room surely knows, of course, about the significant ethical issues swirling around the Supreme Court, including, justices accepting gifts and favors from wealthy pals, justices' spouses playing a role in matters before the court, justices seemingly unable to differentiate between their personal and professional roles. And I think it's no wonder, therefore, seeing that Americans now have an unfavorable view of the court, according to Pew Research this summer, which is also fueling one of the sharpest partisan divides in the country. Only a majority of Americans now have an unfavorable view of the Supreme Court. And it is only 24% of Republicans, only 24% of Democrats, but 73% of Republicans see the nation's top court favorably. It wasn't always like that. In the mid-'80s, 80% of Americans had a favorable view of the Supreme Court. So it's not mysterious, of course, how that happened. It's because we know now, better than we ever had before, what's going on behind the doors of the court and in the private lives of the justices, and that's the case because of the hard-hitting reporting of the most opaque branch of government. Otherwise, we wouldn't know about this. Imagine that, in fact, Clarence Thomas was on the Supreme Court for almost 3 decades before anybody realized that he had been accepting free luxury vacations and all sorts of other favors from a Texas billionaire. Most Americans still don't know the name of Leonard Leo, whom Justice Thomas referred to as the 3rd most important man in the world. Makes you wonder who the first 2 might be. And whose marshalling of right-wing forces forged the current court majority. We know a lot about Leonard Leo now. We know about the ethical breaches of the justices in large part because of the continuing reporting of ProPublica, a nonprofit newsroom founded 17 years ago that has since then been a major force for the kind of truth-telling that is honored tonight with the Nellie Bly Award. On a personal note, I have to say I was very pleased to be part of the judging panel for this because the Times-Union, during my editorship, was the first newspaper partner of ProPublica. Did you know that? An article by a ProPublica reporter, Abraham Litzgarten, that appeared on the front page of the Times-Union in 2008 first detailed the risks of drilling in the Marcellus Shale, which is the rock formation containing natural gas that's spread beneath the state's southern tier. And it was that revolution that began the anti-fracking movement in America. That at least is what is reported in some of the papers in WikiLeaks. Now, how Abraham's story and WikiLeaks came together, I'm not sure, but the notation there is that that was the genesis of the anti-fracking movement in America, and ProPublica was there on the front page of the Times-Union. I recall it well. I was on the phone with Steve Engelberg, now ProPublica's editor-in-chief, nailing down the details of the story as the moving truck was on his front lawn in Oregon, so that his family could join him for his new job in New York. So there's a long, let's hear that. All right, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. So there's a long connection here in this place to the news organization that we honor with this award. So let me just introduce to you the panel, because we're going to talk about investigative reporting more than just that. Andy Kroll is a reporter for ProPublica whose coverage area focuses really on the nexus of politics, money, power, and democracy, or I believe your words are how the wealthy convert financial capital into political capital. He was previously the Washington bureau chief for Rolling Stone. He was a senior reporter at Mother Jones. He's written for many other great titles. Ilya Marritz, no, is that where the accent goes? Marritz. Okay, let me just, he's a radio guy, you got to get this stuff right. Ilya Marritz was for more than a decade a journalist at New York Public Media, WNYC, the nation's preeminent public radio station, where he shared a Peabody Award. He and Andy, along with their colleague Andrea Bernstein, produced the investigative series We Don't Talk About Leonard, the aforementioned Leonard Leo, that was published a year ago this weekend, as a matter of fact. And after a year at Harvard on a Nieman Fellowship, he's now doing a project as a reporter for the Boston Globe. Dr. Julie Novkov is professor of political science and dean of the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at UAlbany. Now, Julie joined UAlbany in 2006 after a decade on the faculty at the University of Oregon, a return to the East, actually, where she got a bachelor's at Harvard and a law degree at NYU, and she went off to Michigan for graduate studies in political science, and I guess she just kept going west for a while. She's been co-editor of the American Political Science Review. A decade ago, she wrote an influential book on the relationship of the Supreme Court and the presidency. So she's actually an expert on some of the topics that we're talking about here. And Brendon Lyons, managing editor for investigations and state coverage at the Times-Union, whose quarter century at the Times-Union began in crime coverage. You may draw whatever conclusions you wish by what he now oversees. And I just have to say, I've worked with a lot of great investigative reporters, both in my earlier career as a reporter before I became an editor, and I'll tell you, I have not worked with a better reporter day in and day out than Brendon Lyons, and we're lucky to have him in this community. So I'd like for us to look today at both the how and the why of reporting, a bit of the how it is that investigative journalists do their job with the reporting. Let me just see if I can get this stool here. With the reporting at SCOTUS, really at the point in particular, and then why it matters, or whether it actually matters anymore, given the general low regard for journalists in the United States, which makes you wonder if the work that journalists do is really having much impact anymore. So I guess I'd like to start with our two friends from ProPublica, and to talk about how you pierce the secrecy of an institution like the Supreme Court, and what skills perhaps most matter in reporters in trying to ferret out what citizens deserve to know about their institutions, but which those in power often don't want to tell us. How does it get done?
How does it get done? Well, thank you for the great introduction, by the way, and I hear the radio voice there as well, so I'm sucked in. How does it get done? It's not glamorous. It's not usually like what you see in the movie portrayals of this kind of work. It's usually quite different from that. This story in particular was, I feel like, had these kind of revelatory moments for us doing what we do repeatedly throughout. I think the origin actually was a story that we did in the fall of 2022, excuse me, almost more than 2 years ago, that started with a tip. And I can't get into who the tipster was and all of that for obvious reasons, but a tip that involved this gentleman, Leonard Leo, who some of you have probably heard of. If you haven't, he is this behind-the-scenes player, legal activist, lawyer. He ran the Federalist Society for a long time, this conservative legal group, and is really the driving force behind the Supreme Court conservative majority today. And we got this tip that he had been put in charge of the largest political donation in American history that we knew of, which is saying something. The total was 1.6 billion with a B, $1.6 billion. That a mysterious figure in Chicago, who we later learned was essentially the power strip magnate of the world, had given his life's fortune to Leonard Leo and essentially said, keep doing what you're doing, Leonard, go get him. It's a big story. Certainly the fact that we had stumbled onto, in some ways, the most lucrative political donation in history was a fascinating turn. And so we reported out that story, and there are some fascinating twists and turns in that as well. But doing that story opened our eyes to this world around the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was covered mostly by the opinions that it issued, by the decisions that it rendered and the impact of those decisions on the country and the people of the country, and how lives were changed, fortunes made and lost, etc. But no one was really talking about the kind of behind-the-scenes machinations of the court, the fact that there are people who are influencing the court, lobbying the court, who are possibly currying favor with the justices. And so from there, we put this team of people on this beat that didn't really exist, the intersection of money and influence and this seemingly impenetrable institution of the United States Supreme Court. And some of us continue to write about Leonard Leo, and that surfaced an entirely new world that I think a lot of people didn't know existed about the lobbying that goes into the Supreme Court, the money that swirls, the way that donors and wealthy individuals interact with the justices behind the scenes. And then some of our colleagues went down the path of trying to find out what the sort of actual transactions, what the influences, what what we found out was, the sort of lavish lifestyle that several of the justices were living, thanks to this small group of people around the court. Harlan Crow, a billionaire, being one of them. And obviously these colleagues, Justin, Elliot, Josh Kaplan, Alex Mierjeski, and others, opened our eyes to a world that, again, a lot of people did not know existed, that justices were taking gifts from wealthy individuals, traveling the world, having properties purchased, having their relatives' school paid for. And again, no one knew this was happening. The justices weren't disclosing it, which is part of the reason no one knew it was happening. It was part of the reason that this journalism was so critical. And there was no secret to unlocking this world that we exposed through these stories. It was thousands and thousands of phone calls. It was finding people who had some kind of role. I don't want to give away too much here because I can't for sourcing reasons, but when a yacht travels through Indonesia for 10 days, there are people who are on the yacht, and then there are people who are maybe working on the yacht. And just imagine this sort of kinds of people, the hundreds of people who make the lives of a billionaire go round, and you can start to imagine how you would pierce through the secrecy and how you might understand why Justice Clarence Thomas is, again, on a yacht island hopping in Southeast Asia. So I hope that gives a little bit of a sense of how we did it. What have I missed?
Well, I want to also just echo Andy saying thank you for the great introduction. I also have to add that I was a Brahms co-reporter for the radio version of that story about fracking in New York. And so we at WNYC, which is where I worked at the time, got to play audio of the state's top regulator for oil and gas, me and Abram peppering him with questions, asking his plan to regulate this wholly new for here practice of fracking for natural gas, and he stammered and he didn't have answers, and that was just an immensely powerful moment of audio, although the article was also great. I want to say, so I've been in and out and around ProPublica for a really long time, but I am essentially an audio guy, an audio storyteller, public radio, and now podcasts. And one of the phrases that I've heard that you hear sometimes around ProPublica, and I think it's really powerful, is intellectual scoop. And I would distinguish an intellectual scoop from a scoop in that a scoop, in my mind, is sort of like that thing in the newspaper. It's like nobody else had it and it's happening right now, but often it is just 5 minutes ahead of the competitors. And an intellectual scoop is a whole different way of looking at a set of facts, or a whole new set of facts around some facts that you already knew that cause you to see everything differently. And I think that was the incredible power of this particular series. It was really interesting about the Supreme Court. It was really interesting to hear longtime Supreme Court journalists being interviewed, often about ProPublica's reporting, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with those journalists. They're legal journalists. They help us to understand the Supreme Court's decisions. But what they hadn't been looking at was a thing that they had been maybe not seeing, but kind of sensing, understanding on some level, that justices are human beings, that there are ways to get in front of them or put people in front of them the same way that there are for any of us. They are not gods, they are mere mortals, and that this particular kind of influence campaign had been playing out quietly, real subtle for several decades. And it's exactly that kind of situation that demands intellectual scooping. And so that made it really thrilling to work at an organization like ProPublica that is so dedicated to that kind of reporting.
Would you also just mention, because you're talking about the sound of that state regulator stammering around, so much of the work that you have to do in audio requires real sound, natural sound, people's voices, which I think of as being difficult for investigative reporting, because so much of investigative reporting is about details, which is where corruption lives. How do you bring an investigative story to life in sound when so many of the sources are unnamed figures?
It is challenging, but it's sort of the same challenge as with print. I mean, the dirty secret is when the New York Times runs a tens of thousands of words long Sunday feature, or the Times Union or anybody else, a lot of readers don't make it to the end, right? The essence of information transmission is really good storytelling, and that's really hard in any investigation. It is true, though, all the more so when you don't have a character say, or when you know that a thing happened, but you can't explain it really easily. And I'd be curious what Andy would say. Andy was a full participant in our Leonard Leo audio project, but I think a big piece of it is just getting together and iterating, writing those scripts, pulling in what you have, turning out your pockets, looking at absolutely every tool you have, and then trying to tell a story that is going to really matter for people. And if you know what that story is, if you understand what your purpose is, you will find a pathway.
Brendon, could I ask you, are you doing much of the audio side of things now, or how do you find your work changed by the digital revolution now that we're in the middle of this?
Well, it is a 24-hour news cycle now, and it's amazing to me. It's gotten to the point where a lot of agencies, a lot of officials will not respond to you immediately, and they'd rather miss your deadline, see your story published, and then have the luxury of commenting once they know what you're going to write. We're starting to pull back on letting them do that too. But podcast, video, we're doing more now where reporters will do short snippets on Instagram. Anybody know what Instagram is? But to sort of sell their stories, give a summary of it, to draw readers in. So we really have to embrace those new mediums, especially if we're going to reach out and touch. What concerns me the greatest is the younger audience, the people that in their 20s, their teens, their 30s, that you still hope will appreciate great investigative journalism and realize that it exists beyond just the sound bites that they're seeing on these social media sites.
Well, I think that gets to kind of a question I want to bring Julie in right at this point before we go back to some of these. I mean, there are so many interesting issues here, but one is the impact of reporting, because I think all journalists get into this line of work with an idea in mind of making a difference, which is difficult these days because of the credibility of journalism, because of how people consume information. Do you think do you see an indication that the ProPublica reporting or other reporting that has followed in the Supreme Court has changed much? is the loss, and I would ask you as a Supreme Court scholar, is the loss of confidence in the Supreme Court, measured by the Pew Research, a price worth paying for the public exposure of what the justices apparently don't consider to be corruption?
Well, it is quite interesting. The Supreme Court is at perhaps certainly a modern historic low in public perceptions of its legitimacy. And there are really two components to that. Political scientists have been paying a lot of attention to what we call the Dobbs effect. A lot of people don't like Dobbs and don't believe that that was a legitimate decision. But the ProPublica reporting has certainly been part of that dynamic as well. And the court, particularly John Roberts, has been very interested in trying to assert the legitimacy of the institution and protect the legitimacy of the institution. There may be some things that he can do with tweaking decisions, trying not to make as much news, but the court has placed itself in the news thanks to the work that you're doing. And the fact that that coverage has gotten so much interest has encouraged other reporters to pick up this frame and take a more holistic view of the court. The court justices have for quite a long time been out on the lecture circuit. This is not a new thing for the Roberts Court. If you go all the way back to the Warren Court, those justices were out there giving speeches, trying to encourage people to see what they were doing as legitimate. But what's new is that we're paying a lot more attention to what they're doing out there on the lecture circuit, and noticing when sometimes some of that activity seems to be kind of crossing a line that we hold between representing the court as an institution and taking political positions.
I want to thank you for the way you phrased that. The court has placed itself in the news. It is the actions of the justices and of the court that has drawn the attention of the journalists who have reported it. And I think the question is what Brendon was alluding to with Instagram is it kind of goes to the heart of how you have impact. What do you do to make your work sing, to make it accessible to people so that it will have impact? Or are there enough people, enough insiders? Are you only writing for 10,000 people who need to know what you're doing to make an impact?
Our goal is to reach as many people as possible. It's definitely to reach beyond a group of insiders, though we care about the kinds of people who are in a position to pressure the Supreme Court to adopt a more rigorous ethics code, for instance. If there are members of Congress, if there are esteemed legal scholars out there who read our work and use it as a way to encourage the court to step up more on, say, the ethics front, that's great, but our goal is to reach much broader than that. And I mean, we come at it in, I think, ways that are borne out in the work itself. And then, as Brendon was saying, in the ways that you, today in journalism, have to be nimble and you have to be creative and you have to think in different mediums to reach all of the different audiences that you want. So in terms of impact is a North Star, the North Star at ProPublica. I was just in a job interview the other day, and one of our top editors was grilling a candidate about, what do you think about impact? What about impact? And he kind of eventually was like, wow, you guys are really obsessed with this idea of impact. And Ginger, the editor, was like, yeah, we are. Like that, and you need to be too. So it was got a clear taste of that. You can't control impact, obviously, but you try to pick stories and subjects that have that. And we write our stories in ways that don't embellish the facts, don't shade the facts. I mean, I think these Supreme Court stories, especially if you read them, I know from editing them, it was a constant process of paring back, getting these stories to the absolute leanest, most factual form possible. We didn't want anyone to say, you shaded the facts in a way to make it seem worse than it was. I remember a debate this is an example. I remember a debate over the use of the term mega yacht. And an editor raised this question, like, it's a big yacht, okay, we get it. Like, don't call it a mega yacht, you're shading it. But actually, mega yacht is a legal term, legal and commercial term. A certain kind of yacht at a certain size is not factually a yacht. It is a mega yacht. And this is a tiny, kind of silly thing, but we were scrutinizing stuff down to that level because we did not want anyone to have a chance to say, this is, unfair. And then when the story comes out, we're doing things on Instagram. Doing a podcast was a big part of that. Let's reach a whole audience of people who want to learn about Leonard Leo and the Supreme Court, but they only want to do it through their earbuds.
Yeah, I would say maybe the stickiest piece of all of that were some of the photos that our colleagues were able to get from various foreign vacations, yacht side happenings. There's a painting of Leonard Leo with Justice Thomas and Harlan Crow and a number of other kind of key people from this universe, and they're all together in the painting. And the painting is kind of photorealistic, and it really perfectly kind of exemplifies the closeness among these five men. If you can get something like that, you may not reach, was it 5? It might have been 7, I'm not sure. You may not reach everybody with your words, but your story is going to have a lot of impact. So it's not so different actually from kind of elementary newspaper reporting. If you can get a really great illustration, they're going to want to know what it's all about.
Kind of takes your breath away when you first realize that exists, right?
Well, and I'll just say to tout a colleague of ours named Alex Mierjeski, who's on this, he's somewhere on here. Alex is a kind of a new style of reporter. This is probably not fair, new style, but he is someone who has a specialty that I admire, which he is like an internet truffle hound. Like he can find things on Instagram, on Facebook, in archives that you don't know exist. And I know that one of the big breakthroughs in this story was him finding photos of the Thomases on these vacations that had been posted by someone else, a relative or a friend or another guest. Finding photos of Clarence Thomas wearing these polo shirts that were specially made for different trips that he had gone on. And sometimes it's that visual scoop, I guess, or whatever, that visual breakthrough where you say, okay, this exists. We have to report toward this. We have to understand.
That's receipts. That's receipts more than almost anything else. It's just sticky.
Yeah. Brendon, talk about the interesting thing that Ilya was saying about the, you called it not an intellectual scoop?
Intellectual scoop.
Intellectual scoop. So, when you're day in and day out, there's a necessity to hit the scoops of what's going on. You have to report what's happening. How does an investigative journalist find the time? How do you adjust yourself so that you can actually also do the conceptual scoops, the intellectual scoops, not just be on top of what's happening on your beat? How do you weigh those?
You do that by being the duck who's gliding along the surface, but underneath your legs are churning constantly. So, as I talk to the reporters on my team a lot about is that you always have to, it's great to hit singles and doubles. And we do that day in and day out to do our job to give news, but you always need to be looking at what is the home run you're working on the side, and developing that story. And those come through source development, which is one of the most important things in our industry. And we've got to maintain the ability to cultivate sources. And you do that through the integrity of your work, because people trust you. And also, I try to remind them that sending a message to someone on a Twitter direct message or Facebook is not the same as having a cup of coffee with them. That people will say so much more to you across a table than they will through a social media app. And so, but as far as the intellectual scoops, also try to understand the motivation of the person giving you the information. Are we being fair? Is it legitimate to pursue this story? And even if that person has a motive to damage the other side, then you have to do this litmus test of, is it fair? Are we minimizing harm? Is this an important story? Regardless of those motivations.
You mentioned something that's interesting. keeping the sources talking to you through the integrity of your work, even when you're stinging somewhat. This is one of the things that I've appreciated about your work, Brendon, and also by protecting sources. You were talking about this as well. People, I suspect, I know there have been times when the telephone records of public officials have been searched to find a Times Union telephone number, and they've been unable to find it. Because somehow Brendon figures out a way to communicate with people other than by using a telephone, I don't know. Smoke signals or something.
Burner phone.
There was a story we did on parole corruption in the parole system in New York years ago, and the parole officers met with me at the Times Union on a Sunday, and when they described the information that they could provide and what was being done wrong, I said to them, so from this day forward, we will never talk on mobile phones. And what I used to do was go down Wolf Road, as a lot of hotels on Wolf Road, and I would call them from a house phone. Or back then we had pay phones, and they would always call me from a pay phone. And I would sit in their kitchen at night to go through the records that they were giving us. And it turned out that a state police colonel, who was the head of the Division of Parole, used subpoenas to try to find out who had leaked information to us, and never could. So, but that's the sort of steps. It's unfortunate. Governor Cuomo right now is trying to get, through his litigation in sexual harassment lawsuits, is trying to get details on the state police protective service members who had spoken to us during his tenure. So it's...
You know, Julie, think about this in the context of the American political scene, where there is such distrust of journalists and such an assessment that that it's partisanship that drives the reporting. And when you consider the careful approach to the reporting that we're hearing about here, is there hope for American journalism in the context of this political divide these days?
Well, I have to believe there's hope, right? Because what's the alternative? But yeah, we're in a very difficult moment. Again, if you look historically, this is one of the most intensely partisan and polarized moments in American history. We really haven't seen anything like this in most of our lifetimes. And it's going to be a long, slow, hard path out of this place that we are right now. But I have to believe that the kind of really detailed, careful, solid work that the ProPublica team and others like them are doing ultimately will win the day. You have to be able to see the transparency in the work that they're doing is so important, because regardless of where you are, regardless of what your partisan identification is, you can go and see that the homework has been done. And I have to hope that as we move toward a less partisan environment, that spirit will win the day.
You think there's anything that news organizations could do to encourage that? Like if you were running ProPublica as opposed to working for it? Well, maybe not. Okay, if you were running the New York Times, then what would you? Is there a way that this can be, this goal of protecting the value of journalism or projecting the value of journalism to the public can be better understood? Or do we have to start in elementary school by teaching kids how to understand stuff?
I'm pretty pessimistic. I think the way that, I'm very pessimistic. I think the way that discourse works now is antithetical to the way that journalism is designed to work, which is like you sit down and you absorb a thing. It can still happen, but when it does happen, and when an article, resonates, and a lot of people read it and absorb it, it feels like a moment now, because it is so rare that happens, and it's not because there aren't great journalists everywhere doing really good journalism. It's the way that we absorb information. It's the way that information travels. It's the simplicity and the stupidity of the stories that travel around society all the time. I had a visit from my 20-year-old nephew last year. He's a smart kid, and he was hanging out with me and the other Neiman Fellows. I was on this fellowship for journalists, right? So it's like 24 of us, and Sammy, my nephew, like loved everyone and hung out and kind of became like the mascot for a week. But he doesn't read a newspaper, and he doesn't go to the website of, he's in Britain, he doesn't go to like The Guardian or The Times or any of those places. He gets it through TikTok, and I'm like, Sammy, where do you think they get their facts? They get, maybe, if we're lucky, they get their facts from people who are paid to make the news. So I'm really pessimistic, but I'd love to hear a more optimistic view if anybody has one.
I don't know if this is going to help. But in my role, I work with a lot of younger people, right, because they are our students. One thing that I encourage my faculty to keep in mind is that this generation of students, right, think about their experience in watching politics during the whole time they've grown up. The first presidential election most of our undergraduates remember was 2008, and the ones that they really remember vividly are 2020 and 2016. So the models that they have had for what political discourse is, and for what political interaction is, and political disagreement are so corrosive and toxic. So we have a lot of work to do to provide a different kind of model and a different kind of way of thinking about what politics is for this generation in order to re-engage them and break through the cynicism that they've experienced pretty much their whole lives.
But does the revelation of corruption, even at the high court, not run contrary to the effort to reinstill confidence in the system? Or do we only have confidence in journalism? That's kind of almost where I've gotten to. You know, that if the goal is to give people a true understanding of what lies beyond their own experience, which I think is what journalism is all about, that's about the best we can do. And